My guest at this time is Pete Sepp. He's president of the National Taxpayers Union, the largest grassroots taxpayer organization in the United States. He joins us today to talk about an interesting trend now among Republicans at the federal and state levels, and that's a sudden tolerance of discussing increases in the gas tax. Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao has said the idea is on the table when it comes to infrastructure improvements coming through Congress, although she has also said that it's not ideally what she would like to do. In Ohio, however, a Republican governor and a Republican legislature, to a large extent, have just approved gas tax increases as well, to the tune of 10.5 cents for regular gas and 19 cents per gallon for diesel. So, Pete, first of all, thank you so much for being with us. And secondly, what is the reason for the Republicans suddenly being willing to think about this?
I think there are a few reasons. For one, there seems to be public polling information that might suggest a lessening of opposition to gas tax increases. But caution is in order here, because depending on how the question is asked, depending on how such a tax increase might be used, depending on public skepticism over government's ability to deliver on its promises, and depending on gas prices overall, those numbers often shift. In fact, some of the most reliable polls, like The Hill, for example, show the opposition and support for a gas tax increase almost evenly split. And here's the big problem, is how the gas tax is actually used. Most people don't know that under apportionment formulas that are figured out at the federal level, a large portion, 20, even 25% of gas tax revenues aren't actually put into building or maintaining roads. They go to things like scenic beautification projects, bike paths, mass transit. And so when you see high poll numbers for folks supporting a gas tax increase to maintain roads or to fix potholes, they already are in a hole, because the gas tax isn't going to be necessarily used entirely for such things. So again, this is something GOP politicians especially need to approach with extreme caution. There is not a massive public groundswell for a gas tax increase.
What does the gas tax do to the consumer?
Well, of course, gas tax increases are some of the most direct tax increases that consumers can possibly feel. If the income tax rate increases, for example, that may not show up immediately until it goes into paychecks in the form of higher withholding, or it may even not be there. If you curtail a deduction, for example, that may not show up until an individual files their tax return. But a gas tax increase, well, that shows up right at the pump. The minute someone pulls into a gas station, fills up their tank, and notices a higher price, well, there it is. And again, it's important to remember, one reason why so many states, and about half of the states, have enacted gas tax increases since 2013, the reason why so many of them have done it is because gasoline prices have largely been going down. And many politicians are hoping that in this time of relatively low and stable gas prices, they can get away with 10 or 15 or 20 cents per gallon increases.
Right, but just to clarify that, I don't know about every state in the country, but as far as I know, the vast majority of them, they don't have a percentage of your gas bill that is then taxed. It's a specific amount per gallon. So it's not like they're getting less revenue if the overall price is lower.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's 10 cents or 15 cents or 20 cents. A few states like California actually do levy a percentage tax, a sales tax on gasoline. They make out very well when gasoline prices are high, and of course that hurts consumers even more.
So, Pete, the counter-argument to this would obviously be something along the lines of, well, it's obvious that we need infrastructure upgrades. We just had a overpass collapse in Tennessee on a major interstate that could have been a lot worse in human toll than it actually was. We saw what happened in Minneapolis a decade ago. These things need to be addressed. It's going to cost
Yes.
probably $1 trillion or more. We're already running huge debts, so where else is the money going to come from?
There are lots of things we need to do. Very, very first thing we need to do is level with motorists and truck drivers and say, look, every single penny of fuel tax you pay at the federal, state, and local levels will go back into roads. That promise needs to be kept by all governments. It is nowhere near being kept now. As I said, 20 to 25% of federal fuel tax funds are not being spent on roads. At the state and local level, it can be an even higher percentage. That needs to be fixed first. Another thing that can be fixed is more efficient project building. There need to be things like life cycle cost analysis. They have to get rid of these labor laws that raise project costs through the roof. They need to do things like streamlining permitting processes. Those permits add to the overhead cost of building roads and fixing up bridges. We need to address those things before we talk about revenues. But once we do talk about revenues, several things you can do. You can allow the private sector through tax advantage financing to invest more in projects. Road projects don't necessarily have to be solely publicly financed. They can be privately financed too. Another tool that you can certainly look to is vehicle miles traveled taxes. These are user-based taxes that have already been tried out at a pilot level in several states that would replace the federal gasoline tax. They're far more efficient because they're based on the individual's actual use of the road. That would be more stable in the long run because we have to admit the gas tax, which is based on fuel use, is always going to be a problem in generating revenues because cars are becoming more fuel efficient.
The counter-argument to that, then, is going to be that if you want to put the mileage tax on, the folks who live in rural areas are going to get creamed, while the folks who live in cities and don't even drive that much are going to be fine, and the folks who can't afford housing close to the city and have to live 30 or 40 miles away are going to get creamed as well, so it's going to be a regressive tax.
We'll have to make adjustments to the rate of the vehicle miles traveled tax to take that into account. Plus, the fact is, many rural roads can stand up to relatively intermittent use much better than some of the interstates do, in fact. And so we have to take all of that into account. This is not necessarily the perfect solution, but I think there are things we need to consider before we even start putting gas taxes on the table. Lots has to be done on the part of federal, state, and local policymakers to convince the American people that they're serious about reform before raising revenues.
Last topic, Pete, here, and I want to go back to pretty much where you started, and that's the point that ought to be frustrating, I think, to a lot of people, and that's that the money that's supposedly being gathered to address infrastructure needs often doesn't. You mentioned 20 to 25% doesn't even end up there. It ends up in other areas. And for those of us who live in the Washington, D.C. area, you know that, for example, in neighboring Virginia, a few years ago, they had a major tax increase for personal property taxes, as well as, I don't know if it was fuel, I think it was local sales tax that actually was supposed to pay for all these improvements. That didn't necessarily happen. Then they added toll roads, and now they're talking about gas taxes. So how should the typical consumer look at it when there's always another hand in the pocket supposedly to pay for these things?
They have to look at it very skeptically. You know, again, public officials seem to assume that because people are sick of potholes, because they seem willing to pay more to get those fixed, that another tax increase won't be opposed. I think that's a huge mistake. People do have a limit, and they will notice when, once again, politicians' promises fall flat. Just look at the Washington, D.C. area metro rail system for that. A constant money pit that hardly ever improves in its service and yet is always asking for more money. Gas tax dollars help to fund that.
Those of us who are local definitely understand the frustration with that. But as you've explained, this happens with state governments as well. So I think a lot of folks around the country are familiar with the concept, even if they haven't suffered through the D.C. Metro. Pete, always good to have you. Thanks for your time today. Have a great weekend.
You too. My pleasure.
Thank you. Pete Sepp is president of the National Taxpayers Union, the largest grassroots taxpayer organization in the nation. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.